Hey guys, it's Miss Landry, and today we're going to learn a really easy trick to make sure that you get everything that you need on every one of your graphs. So let's jump right into it. Oops. So to start with, let's look at the learning objectives. We always like to start here. By the end of this talk, you should be able to graph your data with all the required parts and not miss out on any points. You should be able to figure out the best intervals for your data on the graph. You should be able to identify the best type of graph for the type of data you have. And then finally, we're going to be looking at some misleading graphs or some mistakes in graphing, and you should be able to identify those. So let's jump in. So to start with, we call this TULIP. So we call it graphing with tulip, like the flower. T stands for title, U stands for units, L is for labels, I is for intervals or scale, and P is for plot points. You have to have all of this on there. Also, I really want you to practice, and I'm going to be pretty picky about this, and I think Ms. Parker and Mr. Newman are as well, but you need to make sure that your graph fills this space available. Don't make it tiny, because we look at a lot of these. So here's an example of a graph. It has a title. It has vertical labels and horizontal labels. You want to make sure that they have units. So for example, if you're doing time on the bottom, is it months? Is it days? Is it hours? Is it years? Notice it has a scale, and we're going to go into each one of these individually. So let's jump right in. Make sure that you know what TULIP stands for. So let's talk about the title first. Your title needs to include both the independent variable and the dependent variable of your study. Okay, it can't be something like Roly-Poly Lab or Friday's Lab or just Lab. Those are horrible titles. To be honest, the title should tell me exactly what your experiment was. The easiest way to write this is to write dependent variable due to, or changes independent variable due to independent variables. So in the Cheeto example, it would be, let me put some text in here. It would be something like, oops, sorry. Anyways, in the Cheeto example, it would be something like changes in hip circumference due to amount of Cheetos eaten. So I did my dependent variable, which was the hip circumference, and my independent variable, which was how many Cheetos they ate. So here are some examples of a graph. The number of, let's look at this one right here, the number of reproducing E. coli bacteria over 10 hours in agar, which it's okay if you don't know what that is, at 25 degrees Celsius. You can basically take a look at this title and almost replicate this experiment. Okay, so it has the variables, right? It has the time, it has everything you need to understand. So this is a really good title. I want you to take a look at this graph or this data table right here and tell me, you've got two different variables here. You've got water depth and you've got temperature. Okay, so I want you to tell me what would your title be if you graph the data table to the left. So pause the video and write your answer in your journal as well as on Edpuzzle if you're doing an Edpuzzle. All right, let's erase all of that. Next is units and labels. So these are super important, and a lot of time kids will put a label but not the units. Okay, so always include the unit so that the reader knows what the graph is showing. Like if I put 20, or I say to you, I'm going to give you 20. Well, 20 what? The unit is really important, and so are labels. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples of some graphs. Remember that when you graph, if I were to draw a little graph here, oops. Okay, this is the x-axis, and this is going to be either your independent variable or time, depending on your experiment. Okay, and then on the y, which is over on this side, let me change colors. Oops. Over here is y. This is your independent variable, what you measured. Oh, I'm sorry, nope, clear that. That's your dependent variable. I kind of screwed that up. So let's do that again. Okay, over here is x. And then over here is y. Okay, that's how you graph it. So let's take a look at this first one here and kind of see what we got. So effect of TV viewing distance on eyesight. It's an okay title. I'm not exactly sure from this how they measure eyesight, right? And take a look at this down here. Distance from TV. Okay, well, if I look at this one, it's 50 what? 50 feet, 50 miles, 50 meters. I mean, an eyesight left. Does that mean the left eye, or how much is eyesight left? I really don't know what this scientist is getting at with this, because the scientist does not have a lot of stuff. So here's an example of, whoops, sorry. Oh shoot, hang on. There we go. Okay, so let's take a look at this. They let us know it was centimeters. That really helps. Now I know how far those people are. They also let us know this was the percent of eyesight left, depending on how far away they are. Kind of a strange experiment, but I thought you guys would kind of get an idea from that. Okay, next is intervals. Intervals are basically, you know, if you look at a graph, let me draw a little graph here, right? And you know you've got like tick marks on the graph paper. That's what we call them, tick marks. So those are like the intersecting lines, okay? So you have to figure out how much should each of these be? And it has to be equal. So I can't go like 5, 20, 100, 500. It has to be equal between each tick mark. So I could go 5, 10, 15, 20, because then I've got 5 in between each, if that makes sense. So to start with, they have to be equally spaced. That's really important. Here's a little equation that might help you, okay? Let's say I have a set of values and it goes from 2 to 100, okay? What I'm gonna do is subtract that. I get 98, and let's say that I have 10 tick marks that I wanna graph this with. So I'm gonna divide that by my number of spaces or tick marks. So I end up getting 9.8. That is what each little thing should be. But let's be honest, 9.8 is kind of a funky, it's kind of a funky number to graph. So what you can do is you can round to the nearest whole number, right? So I can put that number up and my next number would be 10. So I could do each tick mark as 10. That's an easy way to do it. So if we look at this first one up here, whoops, I don't know what is going on with my computer. Okay, first of all, there's no title. That's horrible. But let's take a look at soccer seasons. And notice it goes 0.51, 1.52. So this one has every 0.5, but I want you to take a look at the y-axis. What do you think is wrong with this y-axis? I want you to pause the video and answer the question in your journal or in Edpuzzle or both. Okay, so let's take a look at another one. Here's another, oh my gosh, I am sorry. I don't know what's happening to my computer, but let's take a look at this one. Let's start looking at the question. In general, do you think race relations in the US are either good or bad? So they have to choose one of those. And if you look at it has percentages on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, it has dates. So this would be like September 1994, October 1995, and so on, okay? So tell me in Edpuzzle or in your journals what you think about this graph and how could this interval affect how we look at this graph, if that makes sense. So take a look at that, take a pause the video, write what you think about this graph, and come on back. Okay, let me clear that again. Hang on. Eraser, clear screen. Okay, plot points. So this is just telling you how to plot your points. You guys all know how to do this. You guys have done this a ton in math and probably in science as well. But basically, you're going to use best fit lines for the most part in science. We use best fit lines a lot in science. We also use bar graphs a lot. So those are the two probably most common graphs that you'll use. So first of all, I always want you to use pencil, okay? Because if you make a mistake, it's very hard for me to look at a scribble on a graph. So use pencil. Use a whole graph area. I already mentioned that. Try not to make your graph really small if you have a whole graph paper. If you have multiple lines, you have to have a key. So here you see we have 3 lines, 1, 2, 3, and here's the key that shows you what those lines are. Same thing here. We have 3 different kind of food being sold, so each color indicates the type of food. If you would like a little bit of reading, this is a great resource for you on how to draw a scientific graph. I think it's a great thing if you're struggling a little bit with scientific graphs. Okay. Lastly, I want to go over types of graphs. So the first type of graph that you definitely need to know is a line graph or a scatter plot. So these are used to show transitions or trends and relationships. We also use them to do predictions, and you're going to learn more about that down the road, but basically you can either interpolate or extrapolate. And those are fun words, but you're going to learn how we use those to predict. And then we also use these if your data is over time. So here's an example of let me go back to the mouse, sorry guys. Here's an example of a line graph, okay? So you can see we have our independent variable on the bottom, our dependent variable on the y-axis, and notice that they're using a best fit line or a line of best fit. It's also called a regression line, I believe. It doesn't have to touch all the spots, it just gets as close as possible to most of them. So that's an example of a line graph. And then the next graph is a bar graph. In this case, oops, sorry guys. In this case, we're going to compare categories. You don't want more than like 8 categories on this one because then it starts to get a little bit messy. So here's an example of a bar graph. You guys have all seen those. We have the categories on the bottom here. Okay, color of car, and then the number of car sold, and we kind of just take a look at the differences there. And then we have histograms. Some people think histograms are a type of bar graph, but they're not. They're different. Notice that the bars actually touch. That's very different. So I'm going to highlight this, okay? Notice here the bars are touching each other, whereas here they are not. That is really important because what it means is on the bottom of a histogram, you have continuous numbers. So it could be height, it could be weight, this is number of passengers, whereas up here, you just have categories and there's no they're not continuous. They're separate, independent categories. So that's important to make sure that you know that difference. And then finally, we have pie charts. You guys love pie charts. We probably won't be doing very many pie charts. These are used a lot just to make the data look pretty, but they're used to indicate composition. So how much of a whole does each piece take up? Again, 3 to 7 categories is probably best. If you get too many, it starts to get kind of confusing. Here's a favorite type of movie. 20% picked comedy. I would have expected that to be a bit higher. But that's the types of graphs. So let's just really quickly go over the learning objectives one more time to make sure that you learned everything. And we'll be done. So first of all, you can graph data with all the required parts. Remember that when you're doing a graph, whether it's for an assignment, a homework, a test, or because you are a scientist out in the real world, or a scientist in class, use TULIP. Figure out the best intervals. You can use that equation that I gave you, largest data minus smallest data divided by number of tick marks. You can identify the best type of graph for each data type. If you get confused, you can always come back to these slides. And then finally, I can identify misleading graphs or mistakes in graphing. We're going to practice this one in class. So that's it for today. Have a great day, guys. Thanks.